Picture a bomber, so outdated the Air Force nearly scrapped it before it left the factory floor. Now picture that same obsolete jet flying secret missions over Moscow, erased from official records, disguised as a foreign aircraft, and dropping a real atomic bomb, years before anyone was even allowed to know it existed. This is the untold story of the B-45 tornado. The plane that should have been forgotten. Here is a question that sounds like a trick, but isn't. What do you call an aircraft that was declared obsolete before its wheels ever left the tarmac? An aircraft whose top brass had already written it off, whose production run had been slashed to a token number, whose entire design philosophy had been rendered a relic by newer technology before the paint had even dried on the prototype. Normally, you call it a footnote, a cautionary tale in an aviation textbook, a photograph in a museum with a small plaque that most visitors walk past without reading. That is not what happened to the North American B-45 tornado. Instead, this obsolete bomber went on to do things no aircraft in the world had done before. It flew reconnaissance missions so secret that, according to official paperwork, the men flying them did not exist, and the planes themselves belonged to no nation at all. It became the first jet bomber in history to be shot down by another jet in air-to-air combat, a grim milestone that announced the beginning of a terrifying new era in warfare. It was disguised, repainted, and recrewed in total secrecy to slip past the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, penetrating deep into Soviet territory on a mission so sensitive that the President of the United States could plausibly deny it had ever happened. And almost unbelievably, it was the first jet bomber ever to drop a live atomic weapon. All of this from a plane that, on paper, should never have mattered. That's the paradox at the heart of this story, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because almost everything that follows makes more sense once you understand it. The B-45 tornado was not chosen for greatness. It was not the pride of the Air Force, the machine generals bragged about at press conferences. It was, in the coldest bureaucratic terms, a stopgap. A jet bomber rushed into existence to fill a gap before something better came along. And it is precisely because nobody expected much from the B-45 that the missions eventually handed to it became so extraordinary. When the better bombers weren't ready, when speed and secrecy mattered more than glamour, when the United States and Britain needed an aircraft nobody was watching closely enough to miss, the B-45 was there. So before we get to Moscow, before we get to the shoot-down over the Yalu River, before we get to a squadron of British-flown American bombers erased from history, let's rewind and understand exactly how an airplane engineers considered a dead end on delivery day ended up carrying some of the most consequential secrets of the early Cold War. Chapter 1. Born Obsolete Rewind to the mid-1940s. World War II has just ended, and the victorious Allies are scrambling to absorb every scrap of German aeronautical research they can get their hands on. The Luftwaffe's engineers had been years ahead of everyone else in jet propulsion, and American designers were hungry to catch up. Into this frantic, fast-moving moment steps North American aviation with a proposal. A four-engine jet bomber capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Built around the technology and thinking available right then, in the middle of the decade. The result, introduced in 1947, was the B-45 Tornado, and it looked the part of a transitional aircraft, caught awkwardly between two eras of flight. It had a long, straight fuselage and a segmented, greenhouse-style glass cockpit that stretched from the nose rearward, giving it an almost insect-like profile that set it apart from anything that came before or after it. Defensively, it was almost quaint by the standards of what was coming. Its only protection against enemy fighters was a pair of 50 caliber machine guns mounted in a tail turret, a design straight out of the propeller-driven bomber playbook, just bolted onto a jet. And that straight-wing design was the Tornado's fatal flaw, not in the way you'd expect, Not because it made the plane unsafe, but because it made the plane instantly, irreversibly behind the times. Here's the twist nobody saw coming when the project started. The B-45 had been conceived using data borrowed from Germany's wartime jet research that was itself already a step behind what German engineers were developing by the end of the war. Straight wings were the conventional wisdom in the mid-1940s. But by 1947, the very year the B-45 was rolled out, new aerodynamic research had definitively proven that swept-back wings allowed jet aircraft to fly dramatically faster, cutting through the air with far less drag as they approached the speed of sound. It was one of the most important breakthroughs in the history of aviation, and it landed at the worst possible moment for the Tornado. Because North American had already committed to the straight-wing configuration, the B-45 was, quite literally, obsolete before it entered service. The Air Force knew it. Any pilot who studied the emerging swept-wing prototypes knew it. The production run, originally envisioned as a full-scale bomber fleet, was slashed down to a mere 142 aircraft, a fraction of what a frontline Cold War bomber would normally need. Consider the timing for a moment, because it is almost cruelly precise. North American's engineers had done nothing wrong by the standards available to them. They had taken the best available intelligence, built on genuine wartime research, and produced a jet bomber that flew, that carried a real payload, that met the requirements laid out when the program began. The problem wasn't competence. The problem was a calendar. A single year, 1947, separated the moment the B-45 rolled off the assembly line from the moment the aviation world's understanding of high-speed flight was rewritten. Had swept-wing research matured just 12 months later, the Tornado might well have been remembered as a forward-looking success story, instead of a design already being overtaken by its successors, before it had logged its first operational hour. That is the uncomfortable truth buried inside almost every obsolete label in military history. It rarely means the engineers failed. It usually just means somebody else, somewhere else, finished their homework a little faster. By every conventional measure, the story of the B-45 should have ended right there. A promising idea, overtaken by faster progress, quietly retired to supporting roles and forgotten. That is exactly what should have happened to a plane in its position. Instead, the Tornado's story was only just beginning, because obsolescence, it turns out, is sometimes exactly what a secret mission needs. Chapter 2. A war nobody was ready for. Fast forward to the summer of 1950. North Korean forces pour across the 38th parallel, and the United States finds itself thrown into a war it did not expect and was not equipped for, least of all in the air. American commanders needed something they simply did not have enough of: jet-powered reconnaissance aircraft capable of flying fast, flying high, and coming home with usable photographs of enemy positions. This is where the Obsolete Tornado gets its first unlikely calling. The Air Force scrambled 3 aircraft from a specialized reconnaissance variant, the RB-45C, and rushed them across the Pacific to Yokota Air Base in Japan. This variant had a sealed nose packed with oblique cameras, as many as 12 of them, alongside an ANAP Q-24 radar system, capable of scanning and mapping huge swaths of terrain from an altitude of 45, 0 feet, far above what most contemporary fighters could reach. But here's where the story takes its first genuinely strange turn. This deployment happened so fast, under such tight secrecy, that the unit, designated Detachment A, arrived in the Far East without spare parts, without adequate camera film, without the basic infrastructure a squadron needs to actually function. And on official paperwork, as far as any outside observer could tell, these aircraft simply did not exist in the region at all. A unit that couldn't function on paper, doing a job the Air Force desperately needed done in reality. That contradiction would come to define the entire B-45 story. Try to imagine the position those 3 crews were actually in. They had crossed an ocean to fly the only jet-powered reconnaissance aircraft, the the United States could get into theater in time, carrying equipment capable of mapping enemy territory in extraordinary detail from nearly 9 miles up, and yet, in the most basic logistical sense, they were flying on borrowed time and improvised support. No deep spares inventory to fall back on if something broke. No guaranteed pipeline of camera film to keep the cameras loaded mission after mission. Ground crews adapting on the fly, cannibalizing what they could, making a brand new, barely tested reconnaissance system work through sheer improvisation because Washington needed the photographs, and there was no one else to send. And it very nearly got these crews killed almost immediately. Chapter 3: MiG Alley and the first jet-on-jet kill in history. If you know anything about the early Cold War in the air, you know the name of one particular stretch of sky, MiG Alley, the corridor along the Yalu River where Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters, flown by Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean pilots, hunted anything that strayed too close to the Chinese border. The B-45C was fast for a straight-wing jet. It was not fast enough for this, against the swept-wing MiG-15, the very design philosophy that had rendered the Tornado obsolete on the drawing board. The reconnaissance tornadoes were suddenly, brutally exposed. Slower, less maneuverable, and defended by nothing more than that lone tail turret with its 2 machine guns. They were close to ideal targets for Soviet-piloted interceptors, looking to make a name for themselves. On the morning of December 4, 1950, that vulnerability turned fatal. An B-45C was jumped by 5 MiG-15s and shot down. It was the first time in the history of aerial warfare that a jet fighter had destroyed a jet bomber in air-to-air combat, a bleak, historic first that belonged, unwillingly, to the B-45 Tornado. Think about what that moment represented. This wasn't just the loss of one aircraft and its crew. It was proof, delivered in the worst possible way, that daylight reconnaissance in a straight-wing jet over MiG Alley was now a death sentence. The very obsolescence baked into the Tornado's design from day one had just been paid for in blood. Something had to change, and it had to change immediately. It's worth pausing on just how new this kind of danger was. A few years earlier, aerial combat still largely meant propeller-driven fighters chasing propeller-driven bombers at speeds that gave both sides a fighting chance to maneuver, to see the threat coming, to react. The MiG-15 changed the entire calculation, swept wing, fast and armed with cannon rather than machine guns. It could close on a target far more quickly than any bomber crew's instincts, trained on an earlier generation of aerial warfare, were prepared for. The Tornado crews over MiG Alley weren't just facing a tougher enemy. They were facing an entirely new category of threat that the tactics, training, and equipment of just a few years earlier had never been designed to counter. December 4, 1950 wasn't only a tragedy for the crew lost that morning. It was a warning flare for every air force in the world. The rules of the sky had just changed, permanently, and straight-wing aircraft were now on the wrong side of that change. Chapter 4: Into the dark, so the remaining crews did the only thing that made sense. They stopped flying in daylight altogether. Night reconnaissance sounds safer in theory. In practice, it introduced its own nightmare. To photograph targets in darkness, crews had to pop open the bomb bay and release flash bombs, essentially explosive photographic flares, to illuminate the ground for a split second while cameras captured the image. The problem was that opening the bomb bay doors at altitude caused violent buffeting throughout the airframe, shaking the aircraft so hard that instruments in the cockpit became almost impossible to read at the exact moment precision mattered most. Crews adapted anyway. When conventional instrument reading became unreliable amid the shaking, they leaned more heavily on radar terrain mapping to navigate and locate targets, effectively flying and photographing partially blind, trusting electronics over eyesight. And when Soviet-aligned night fighters did manage to find them in the dark, the response was pure. Raw speed. Crews would firewall the throttles and push the Tornado past 570 miles per hour, wringing every last knot out of an airframe. that was never supposed to be doing any of this in the first place. In white-knuckle chases through the night sky over hostile territory. There was no autopilot for fear and no manual for what these crews were doing night after night. Every sortie meant trusting a jury-rigged workaround, flash bombs instead of daylight, radar returns instead of a clear horizon, raw engine power instead of any real defensive armament, against an enemy that had already proven, in broad daylight, exactly how lethal it could be. And yet the missions kept flying, because the alternative, going dark on reconnaissance entirely, leaving commanders blind to enemy troop movements and airfields, was considered even less acceptable than the risk. Somehow, this Obsolete airplane kept coming home. Night after night, crews accepted odds that would be unthinkable in almost any other line of work. Fly a slow, straight-wing jet into contested airspace, rely on radar and instinct where eyesight failed, and outrun anything that found them by brute throttle alone. There was no glamorous solution to the problem the MiG-15 had created. There was only skill, nerve, and a plane that, whatever its design flaws, still had enough raw speed and reserve to make a difference when it counted. And the intelligence it brought back, however dangerous it was to collect, was about to catch the attention of a general with a much bigger and more audacious idea. Chapter 5. The Ghost Squadron. Now we shift from a shooting war in Korea to a much colder, quieter one, the one being fought in the shadows between Washington and Moscow. By the early 1950s, General Curtis LeMay, head of the United States Strategic Air Command, had a problem that kept him up at night. In the event of a war with the Soviet Union, SAC's nuclear bombers would need to strike specific targets, airfields, housing Soviet bombers capable of hitting the United States and its allies with nuclear weapons of their own. But to strike those targets accurately, especially at night or through cloud cover, using radar-guided bombing, American crews needed detailed radar maps of the terrain surrounding those bases. And nobody had them. The interior of the Soviet Union was, quite literally, a black box. There was an obvious solution. Fly reconnaissance aircraft over those bases and build the maps directly. There was also an obvious problem. President Harry Truman had explicitly forbidden American aircrews from flying over Soviet territory. Direct overflights risked a diplomatic and military catastrophe, potentially even triggering the very war the maps were meant to help prevent. LeMay's entire strategic doctrine rested on a simple, chilling premise. Deterrence only works if you can actually execute the mission you're threatening. A nuclear force that couldn't reliably find and strike its targets wasn't really a deterrent at all. It was a bluff, and bluffs invite the exact kind of miscalculation that starts wars. Without accurate radar maps of the terrain surrounding Soviet bomber bases, American crews attempting a real wartime strike, likely at night or through heavy cloud cover, using radar bombing techniques, would be flying toward targets they had never actually seen. In LeMay's mind, that gap in knowledge was not an abstract intelligence shortfall. It was a crack in the entire foundation of nuclear deterrence, one that had to be closed, no matter the diplomatic risk involved in closing it. So LeMay reached for an option that, on its face, sounds almost too audacious to be real. If American crews couldn't legally do it, what if the crews weren't American at all? LeMay opened secret channels with Britain's Royal Air Force, and with the direct approval of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the two nations agreed to jointly mount a covert reconnaissance program. It would come to be known, with a nod to the art of turning an opponent's own strength against them, as Operation Jiu-Jitsu. Here's the piece of the puzzle that makes this operation so remarkable. The aircraft chosen to fly it were the same Obsolete, straight-wing Tornadoes that had already been quietly written off years earlier. Exactly the kind of aircraft nobody expected to be at the center of one of the most sensitive covert operations of the entire Cold War. Why the B-45 specifically, rather than something newer? Partly because it was already combat-proven as a reconnaissance platform in Korea, with real crews who had real experience flying it into contested airspace and coming home. partly because its high service ceiling gave it a genuine operational advantage for the kind of altitude-dependent radar mapping the mission required. But there was also a colder, more practical logic at work. A program this deniable needed an aircraft whose loss, if the worst happened, would not immediately scream American frontline bomber to the entire world. An aircraft already considered somewhat outdated, already being phased towards secondary roles, was in a strange way the perfect tool for a mission that needed to remain invisible. Nobody scrutinizes the airplane, nobody thinks matters anymore. Chapter 6. Erasing an Identity. What happened next reads less like a military operation and more like an elaborate act of institutional disappearance. 4 B-45C Tornadoes were flown to RAF Sculthorpe, a Royal Air Force base in Norfolk, England. Their ground crews set about a task that had almost nothing to do with mechanics and everything to do with erasure. Every marking identifying the aircraft as United States Air Force property was stripped away. In its place went the roundel insignia of the Royal Air Force, the same circular marking found on Britain's own combat aircraft. On paper, there is no record that this transfer ever took place. No customs document, no formal handover, no line item in any budget. As far as any official record was concerned, these aircraft belonged to nobody. They had, in a very real bureaucratic sense, ceased to be American property, and had not formally become British property either. They existed in a gap between two nations' record-keeping, deliberately by design. And the crews who would fly them were entirely British, hand-selected, and put through training so secretive that even within the RAF's own structure, almost no one else knew what they were preparing for. Think about what this meant in practice. An American-designed, American-built bomber, wearing British colors, flown by British airmen on a mission jointly ordered by an American general and a British Prime Minister, with a paper trail engineered from the outset to convince any outside observer that the whole thing never happened. If the mission went wrong, if an aircraft went down over Soviet territory, there would be no American fingerprints to find. Officially, there would be nothing to find at all. The RAF crews selected for this training were, by every account, exceptional airmen even before Jiu-Jitsu ever entered the picture. But the psychological weight of what they were being asked to do went far beyond ordinary flight training. They were learning to fly an unfamiliar American aircraft type, learning unfamiliar long-range radar navigation techniques, and doing all of it under an oath of secrecy so absolute that they could not discuss the program with fellow RAF officers outside the unit, let alone with family. If they were captured or shot down over Soviet soil, both governments had effectively prearranged to treat them as men without a nation, flying a plane without an owner. That is an extraordinary thing to ask of anyone, and it says a great deal about the caliber of airmen Britain put forward that the operation had no shortage of volunteers. That is precisely what the mission would soon put to the test. Chapter 7. The night they flew into the fire. The night of April 17, 1952, 3 B-45C Tornadoes wearing Royal Air Force markings lifted off into the darkness. Before crossing into Soviet airspace, they rendezvoused with KB-29 tanker aircraft to refuel, all of it conducted in complete radio silence. Running with every external light extinguished, the crews communicating through practiced procedure rather than a single word over the air. Then they split onto 3 separate routes and pushed deep into the territory of a nuclear-armed superpower that had no idea and had never agreed that they were coming. Picture the scale of what these 3 crews were individually attempting. One route swept along the Baltic republics, tracing the northern edge of Soviet territory. A second, the central route, pushed so far inland that the crew could reportedly see the glow of Moscow's lights on the horizon from roughly 180 miles away, close enough to know exactly what city they were flying toward, far enough that they were never meant to be seen in return. The third route cut south through Ukraine toward the Black Sea, cameras running continuously, radar sweeping and recording the terrain below the entire way. This was not a quick dash across a border and back. This was hours of sustained flight, deep inside the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, in unarmed reconnaissance aircraft, whose only real defense was altitude, darkness, and the hope that nobody was looking in the right place at the right moment. Inside each cockpit, the routine would have looked almost deceptively procedural. Navigators cross-checking radar returns against pre-briefed target coordinates, camera operators triggering exposures on a fixed schedule, pilots holding a precise heading and altitude while every instinct screamed at them to be anywhere else. There was no room for drama in the execution, even though the stakes could not have been higher. Total radio silence meant that if something went wrong on one aircraft, the other two would have no way of knowing. Each of the three crews was, in the truest sense, alone over enemy territory, trusting a plan built in secret and a government on the other end that had committed, in advance, to denying they had ever sent them. Somebody was looking. Soviet ground radar picked up the intrusions, and interceptors were scrambled to hunt down the unidentified aircraft violating Soviet airspace. For a stretch of the mission, 3 lightly defended, straight-wing bombers, the same design that had already proven fatally vulnerable to MiG-15s in Korea less than 2 years earlier, were being actively hunted over the one stretch of the planet where getting caught meant potentially triggering a war neither side could contain. And yet, aided by the tornado's high service ceiling and the near-total darkness they'd deliberately flown into, all 3 aircraft slipped through. Every single one made it back out of Soviet airspace and returned safely to base. Consider, too, what safely returned actually required. Each aircraft had to relocate its tanker for a second air-to-air refueling on the way out. Again in total darkness, again in radio silence, again with fuel margins thin enough that any navigational error could have turned a triumphant return into a forced landing, or worse, on the wrong side of a border that offered no sanctuary. Getting into Soviet airspace undetected was only half the achievement. Getting 3 low, slow, unescorted bombers back out again, past the same alerted air defense network, without a single loss, was arguably the more improbable half. By any measure, that alone should have been the triumphant climax of this story, a daring, secret penetration of the Soviet Union's most sensitive airspace, executed flawlessly, with every aircraft and every crew coming home. Roll credits, except that isn't what happened. Because when the film canisters were finally developed back in England, the crews discovered something that turned quiet triumph into a much messier, much more human story. Chapter 8. The twist nobody expected. Here's the reverse-thinking gut punch of the entire operation. After everything, the false flags, the erased paperwork, the radio silence, the hours spent deep inside hostile airspace while interceptors hunted for them, the mission's success came down to equipment. Nobody had double-checked on the ground. When the radar film was processed, technicians discovered that 2 of the radar cameras had been set with the wrong calibration before the aircraft had even taken off. Not sabotage, not enemy action, a ground-level equipment error, the kind of mundane mistake that happens on any complex mission. Except this time it happened on one of the most dangerous and diplomatically explosive reconnaissance flights of the entire Cold War. The damage wasn't total, but it was significant. Of the 35 targeted Soviet bomber bases the mission had set out to photograph and map, usable imagery came back for only 20 of them, and roughly half of those images were of poor quality, degraded enough to limit how useful they really were for planning a bombing run. 3 air crews had flown into the heart of Soviet airspace, dodged interceptors, and come home in one piece, only to find that a fraction of what they'd risked everything to capture had been ruined before they ever left the ground. It's a strange kind of irony worth sitting with. The mission's greatest danger came from the Soviet Union. Its greatest disappointment came from a misset dial on a camera at a British airbase. There's a broader lesson buried in that detail, one that applies well beyond this single mission. Espionage and covert reconnaissance are often imagined as contests of pure daring, outflying the enemy, outsmarting their radar, slipping past their defenses through sheer skill and nerve. And Jiu-Jitsu had all of that. But the operation's actual results were shaped just as much by something far less cinematic. Routine technical diligence, the unglamorous business of making sure equipment is calibrated correctly before it matters. All the courage in the world could not undo a miscalibrated dial. The crews had done everything asked of them, flawlessly, under conditions that would break most people. And the mission's ultimate value was still capped by a mistake made hours before anyone even took off. Operation Jiu-Jitsu did fly again after that first mission, refining and repeating the formula. But the danger never went away. If anything, it escalated. A follow-up flight in 1954 came close to disaster when a Soviet night fighter attempted to bring down one of the aircraft, using a ramming technique, deliberately trying to collide with the reconnaissance plane rather than shoot it down conventionally. That close call was the final straw. Shortly afterward, the entire program was shut down for good. For a mission built entirely around not existing, Operation Jiu-Jitsu had come remarkably, terrifyingly close to becoming an international incident on more than one occasion. That it never did, that no aircraft was lost, no crew was captured, and no diplomatic crisis erupted, is arguably the most extraordinary part of the whole story. Imagine for a moment the counterfactual. Imagine one of those RAF-F-marked, American-built bombers going down over Ukraine or the Baltic coast in 1952, its crew captured alive by Soviet forces. Moscow would have had physical proof of a foreign military aircraft violating its airspace, flown by uniformed personnel from a nation it was not at war with, on a mission that both London and Washington had agreed in advance to deny any knowledge of. It is not hard to imagine how that scenario could have spiraled, a genuine diplomatic firestorm, at one of the most volatile moments of the entire Cold War, precisely when both sides were still feeling out the rules of a nuclear standoff. Neither had fully learned to manage. The fact that this operation ran repeatedly for roughly 2 years, without ever producing that nightmare scenario, is a testament to careful planning, disciplined execution, and frankly, no small amount of luck. Chapter 9. The bomb nobody talks about. While the reconnaissance side of the B-45 story was unfolding in almost total secrecy, another chapter was being written that history has, strangely, given even less attention to. In 1951 and again in 1952, a B-45 Tornado bomber crew carried out live nuclear weapons drop tests over the Pacific, releasing real atomic bombs and successfully egressing to a safe distance before detonation. It's a milestone that tends to get lost in the shadow of the more famous reconnaissance missions. But it deserves to be said plainly. The B-45 Tornado was the first jet bomber in history to drop an actual nuclear weapon in a live test. Stop and consider what that means for the arc of this story. The same basic airframe considered too outdated for frontline bomber duty, the same design overtaken by swept-wing aerodynamics before it ever entered service, was simultaneously proving itself capable of doing something no jet aircraft had ever done before, safely delivering the most destructive weapon humanity had ever built, and living to tell about it. Obsolete on the drawing board, first in the world in the cockpit. There is an important distinction worth making here, because it's easy to blur the line between a test drop and a token gesture. This was not a training exercise with an inert dummy shape standing in for a real weapon. This was a live nuclear weapon, released from a jet aircraft over the open Pacific, with the crew required to execute a precise, high-speed escape maneuver to put enough distance between themselves and the detonation point before the weapon actually went off. Every part of that sequence, the release, the timing, the escape profile, had to work correctly on an aircraft type that was, in every other conversation happening in the Air Force at the time, being discussed primarily in terms of when it would be phased out. It is a genuinely strange juxtaposition, a program planning the Tornado's retirement in one meeting, and a program trusting the Tornado with live nuclear ordnance in another. Chapter 10. Backbreaker. A permanent nuclear presence in Europe. The nuclear capability proven in those Pacific test drops didn't stay theoretical for long. In May of 1952, roughly 40 B-45A bombers were deployed under a program called Operation Backbreaker, equipping them to carry nuclear weapons and stationing them permanently in Britain. This marked the first time the United States had based nuclear-capable jet bombers on a permanent footing anywhere in Europe, a major, deliberate escalation in Cold War nuclear deterrence, and a clear signal to Moscow about what the alliance was now prepared to do. And here is where the story loops back on itself in a way that feels almost too neat to be true, except that it is. The bomber crews of Operation Backbreaker, training to strike targets deep inside the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons, used radar maps to study and rehearse their approach to those targets. Those maps had been built using imagery gathered during the covert Operation Jiu-Jitsu reconnaissance flights, the same secret missions flown by disguised, RAF-marked tornadoes months earlier. The two programs were, in effect, two halves of the same weapon system, one half quietly gathering the targeting data in the dark, the other half openly, visibly prepared to use it. And yet, this is the detail that makes the whole arrangement feel like something out of a spy novel. The crews flying the nuclear deterrent missions had no idea the reconnaissance missions had ever happened. The reconnaissance crews, sworn to total secrecy, had no visibility into how their imagery was ultimately used. Two groups of airmen, flying the same type of aircraft, serving the same strategic goal, each completely unaware the other existed. Compartmentalization taken about as far as it can go. Step back and look at the whole arrangement from above, and it becomes almost architectural in its logic. At the top, a general and a prime minister, aware of the full picture, coordinating a program too sensitive to put in writing. In the middle, one set of RAF crews, disguised, deniable, flying into the Soviet Union to gather intelligence they would never see used. At the bottom, another set of USAF crews, publicly stationed, openly training, rehearsing strikes against targets whose defining terrain features had arrived on their desks without any explanation of where the information had actually come from. Every layer of that structure existed specifically so that if any single layer was compromised, the layers above and below it could remain protected. It is a masterclass in Cold War operational security, built again around an aircraft nobody in 1947 would have predicted deserved that level of trust. Chapter 11. Quiet retirement. Every fast-moving story eventually slows down, and the B-45s did too. Right on schedule with the technological curve that had doomed it from the start. By 1957, the straight-wing B-45 began stepping aside for the aircraft that had rendered it obsolete in the first place. The B-47 Stratojet, a six-engine bomber, built around exactly the swept-wing design philosophy that had made headlines back in 1947, the very year the Tornado had rolled out, already behind the times. The last B-45s left active service in 1958, retiring not with fanfare or public recognition, but quietly, almost anonymously slipping out of the military's active roster. No parades, no headlines, just a slow fade from the record, fitting for an aircraft whose most important missions had never officially been on the record to begin with. Most of the men who had flown its most dangerous sorties returned to ordinary postings, ordinary careers and ordinary lives, carrying stories they were legally bound not to tell, not to their commanding officers outside the program, not to their spouses, not even in many cases, to the historians who would spend decades afterward trying to piece together exactly what Strategic Air Command and the Royal Air Force had actually been doing in the early 1950s. Chapter 12. Declassified. For decades after its retirement, the B-45 Tornado sat in the same place its most secret missions had always occupied, officially unacknowledged. Operation Jiu-Jitsu, one of the boldest covert reconnaissance programs of the early Cold War, remained fully classified until 1994, more than 40 years after those 3 disguised bombers slipped through Soviet airspace and made it home. For over 4 decades, the men who flew those missions could not tell their families, their colleagues, or history itself what they had actually done in the skies over the Baltic states, over Ukraine within sight of Moscow's lights. By the time the files were finally opened, many of the crew members who had lived through those nights were elderly, and some had already passed away, without ever being able to speak publicly about what they had risked. Declassification in this case didn't arrive as vindication in real time. It arrived as history quietly catching up to a truth that had been sitting, sealed, for a full generation. It's worth asking why a program like Jiu-Jitsu stayed buried for so long, even after the Cold War itself had cooled considerably. Part of the answer is procedural. Intelligence gathering methods, and the specific vulnerabilities they exploit, tend to stay classified long after the original mission is irrelevant, simply because similar techniques and relationships might still be in use. But part of the answer is also diplomatic. Operation Jiu-Jitsu was, at its core, an admission that 2 Allied governments had knowingly disguised military aircraft, erased ownership records, and sent foreign nationals to overfly a third country's sovereign territory, without any legal authorization to do so. That is the kind of admission governments are in no hurry to make, even decades later, even about a Cold War that has technically ended. Let's return, finally, to where we started, an aircraft judged obsolete before it ever entered service. A fallback option, chosen not because it was the best tool available, but because it was the only tool available at the exact moment history needed one. And yet it was this Obsolete plane, not the newer, more celebrated designs, that ended up carrying some of the most dangerous, most consequential secrets of the entire early Cold War. The first jet ever downed by another jet in combat, the first jet bomber to drop a live atomic weapon, and the aircraft at the center of a joint American-British covert operation, so sensitive it stayed buried for over 40 years. During the most dangerous stretch of the Cold War, the years when the West genuinely did not know what the Soviet Union's nuclear bomber force looked like or where it was based, the years when that uncertainty alone could have triggered catastrophic miscalculation on either side. It was the B-45 Tornado, the plane nobody expected much from, that helped keep the West from flying blind into a war it wasn't ready for. Obsolete on arrival, indispensable when it mattered most, sometimes history's most important tools are exactly the ones everyone else has already written off. There's a reason this particular story tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. We're conditioned to expect that the most important chapters of military history belong to the aircraft everyone remembers. The ones with the famous silhouettes, the record-breaking speeds, the Hollywood cameos. The B-45 Tornado has none of that cultural afterlife. Ask most people, even most aviation enthusiasts, to name a Cold War bomber, and the B-45 is unlikely to come up at all. It sits in the shadow of the B-47 that replaced it, and the B-52 that followed after that, a strange glass-nosed, straight-wing footnote squeezed between 2 more famous designs, and yet, measured purely by the weight of what it was trusted to do. The first jet ever brought down by another jet in combat, the first jet bomber to release a live atomic weapon, and the airframe chosen for one of the most audacious joint covert operations 2 Allied nations ever ran against the Soviet Union. The Tornado's fingerprints are on more pivotal moments of the early Cold War than almost any other aircraft of its era receives credit for. It never got the reputation. It got the missions instead, and in the strange arithmetic of history, that turns out to be the rarer, more consequential thing to have.